from me to we in the art of classic film. And so this beautiful illustration that you see here was done by Tim Langendorfer, who is the gifted artist who has illustrated about 9 of our films, including It's a Wonderful Life and Roman Holiday and Key Largo. And here is our Raising the Sun. So this is our own Educational Guidance Institute original poster. And this is the title for our film study, Love and Freedom in the Life of a Family. Okay. So we might think about those 2 words, life, love and freedom, and what this and how this is shown and depicted in the film when the questions come up later. Here's our beautiful Lorraine Hansberry, author of Raisin in the Sun. This gives you a time capsule here. The play opened at the Ethel Barrymore Theater on March 11th, 1959, and it was a great success. Lorraine had walked up and down the streets of Broadway to shop her play, and it took her a while, but once David Susskind was the producer who went with her, and he was quite famous in the day for plays on Broadway, and also he was in the golden age of television, and put on programs and plays on television. So he believed in Lorraine, and they produced the play, and it was a great success. She had grown up on the south side of Chicago. Her father was a successful businessman in the Black community. Her mother was a school teacher. So Lorraine's family background is different from the Younger family. They're very definitely struggling, working, lower class. Lorraine's family was able to be in the middle class. And also, Lorraine's dad and mom did actually fight to get fair housing for themselves in a white neighborhood. So when Lorraine wrote this story, this play, she was basing it on the very experiences that her own family had, except that her father would have been very proactive and strong, not, like the Younger family, but that was the original inspiration, was right in her own family. And they were attacked, and they were spat on, and they were persecuted, but they persevered in that neighborhood. Tragically, she did die young. She died in 1965 of pancreatic cancer. You had a question, Bill?
I noticed in your study guide that the lawsuit that her father filed went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it resulted in a striking down of these segregationist type of laws in neighborhoods. They made it illegal to discriminate based on race as far as where people could live.
Yes. So it's very important. The play is important culturally and historically, and Lorraine's own family played this hugely important historic role. Yes, go ahead. From Broadway to Hollywood and the power of an ensemble cast. This would be a very unique situation where all 4 of these people played their same roles on Broadway. Ruby Dee, Diana Sands, and Claudia McNeil joined Sidney Poitier on the Broadway stage, and then they carried their roles over in the making of the film. And some commentary came, I think it might have been from Sidney Poitier or one of the other players, that it was so much easier for them because they knew each other so well, and they had been the younger family on Broadway in the play. So that's one of the reasons why this strikes such a chord of realism for this family, because these people really were almost like a family. They were, in a sense, a family.
So Sidney Poitier was on Broadway first before they
Yes, yes.
Okay.
They all played the same roles on Broadway.
That's pretty unusual too, when you say usually they recast it to make a film if it's going to go from Broadway.
Right. Well, of course, all of this was completely history making, because you had the first Black woman playwright to have a hit play on Broadway. It was a success. And then you had the very first time in Hollywood history that you would have a film that was all Black actors with the major roles. I mean, there's only one white character in there, and it was successful. It's surprising now when you look back. I guess it was just so revolutionary for its time, but really, I believe that Sidney Poitier should have been nominated for his performance, but so it did escape the attention of the Academy Oscar sweepstakes. But at the same time, as I said, I saw this film, in my senior year at Whittier College. I had just come back from my exchange student semester at Howard University. And as I said last week, it was just in the air, the whole sense of things going on. I'll talk about it in the presentation here. The lunch counter sit-in started in 1960. The spring semester that I was at Howard was the very first beginning of the lunch counter sit-ins. That very month that Martin Luther King came to Rankin Chapel to urge us to stand up with our brothers and sisters down south. So when Raisin in the Sun hit the theaters in 1961, it was just very much just so right for that very year that it would come out in the theaters, because it was going to make a statement, and it did make a statement about the basic common humanity that we share. Why would this role be considered his greatest performance? Donald Bogle, who is an African-American film critic, and he's appeared on Turner Classic Movies, and he says without any question that in his view, this performance as Walter Lee Younger is Sidney Poitier's greatest performance. And I think Jess kind of touched on it a little bit when she said that she didn't like Walter Lee Younger's character very well. And actually, Sidney Poitier said the same thing. He was stuck playing somebody that he really didn't like very well. But it's something to think about as to maybe why his achievement in this film is so great, and maybe the best he ever did.
So, all right, students, Jess and Roxana and Christian, anyone that can hear, can you want to weigh in on this? Do you have any thoughts as to why this role might have been his best?
The raw emotion, the scene that's sticking out to me is when the mother says that she bought a house and he's holding the beer glass, and the look and the tension, and he breaks it in his hand, and how he just
can do that. It really took some, he was really upset, wasn't he? Yeah. Christian says the same thing. It's because he was more emotional in this than other films, probably.
This again is our lovely little heroine, Ruby Bridges. One of the reasons why this film is so deeply tied to the early civil rights movement, as well as it being in its own right symbolic of the humanity of African Americans, is that little Ruby was stuck having to be this youngster going to integrate an elementary school in Mississippi. And she just trooped out there every day. The white mobs would be spitting at her, yelling at her. And later on, the very famous psychiatrist, Robert Coles, he won a Pulitzer Prize. He was a Harvard psychiatrist, totally broke ground on many, many basic concepts in psychology and human nature. And he wrote a book called The Moral Life of Children. And in chapter 2 of that book is the basic thing that got me started in the early 90s doing this project. Was I read what Robert Coles said about what Ruby said about Raisin in the Sun. And I went back to my own memory of my time at Howard University and my seeing of this movie my senior year at Whittier. And I just really went crazy, frankly. And just, it was an aha moment for me. And here was what Ruby said that really is something to think about. She said, Dr. Coles, if the people spitting at me, she said, the people in the movies it would work on them and maybe they'd listen. So the whole idea of storytelling, I think you were saying, Bill, earlier, all the evidence which can be researched on how storytelling basically builds empathy. And this is all in the neurological studies that have been done. And here's this little 7-year-old girl telling a Harvard psychiatrist, well, if these people could see this story, that maybe they wouldn't spit at me. Maybe they'd listen. Maybe they'd pay attention. Just to put into historic perspective, I just put this little piece in here about the lunch counter sit-ins and wanted that to be part of the presentation, but we've already discussed it pretty well. Let's go on. This is a very important book, The Upswing by Robert Putnam, and his earlier work, Bowling Alone, has been revised, and both of these books have come out October 2020. It was basically the period of the 30s, the mid-1930s, building up to about 1965. And this book is so important because he documents all the different trends, from economic trends, cultural trends, different words that are used in literature. And what started to happen in the mid-1960s is that you would see I, me, my own perspective, my own self-fulfillment, all these kinds of words that stand for radical individualism. Whereas in the earlier period, the words common man, community, let's work together for the greater good, all of those kinds of concepts were so rich in the literature, in the magazines. So this is the basic sociology, science of sociology that Robert Putnam has accomplished. And very important.
you're saying that he argues that the United States of America hasn't always been about radical individualism. I mean,
Well, he proves it. He proves it in spades, and he puts it the rise of the community. He even puts back into the progressive era. He talks about people like Jane Addams and the settlement houses, and points and the church attendance that's measured, the amount of civic groups, campfire girls, Boy Scouts, all of these civic groups started in the 20s, basically. And so he just can absolutely document it. There isn't even any question. By the time you finish his book, the evidence is so overwhelming that there was this golden age that went over decades, and it wasn't just World War II. See, a lot of people say, oh, it was just we were fighting the war. No, it was in the Depression, it was coming and rising. And he also points out that in the 50s, it wasn't just this sort of superficial conformity. There were very serious, good solidarity, community things going on of people working. So anyway, there's just a whole lot there. But when you compare the movies that came out in the same time period, like if you were to go on Turner Classic Movies and see the movies that are the most popular, the ones that people love and want to see again and again, they're going to be the great movies of this era. They're not going to be the movies of the late 60s or the 70s, because those movies were be so often about these radical individuals and the adventures that they're having. And it's just somewhat boring. It's much more interesting to study and learn how people can work together for the good. That's what most of us want. At least that would be my thesis putting forward, which is just what I say here, the rebuilding of the norms and the values that hold us together. That's what the movies talk about.
I'd be really curious what our students who are here tonight have to think about what you just said there as well.
It's probably pretty controversial, I guess.
So just do you all feel like we still have communities, or have we lost something that used to exist in this country, or what are your thoughts just about community, and how do you feel part of a community today? Can someone comment on that? Like I said, you can use the chat if you don't want to speak up.
I feel like we've definitely lost it. I know people like to blame technology, and I would definitely say technology is a big one. People just, I think, have so many options now. I don't know if that's why, but
what do you say to someone who argues? What do you think of the argument that the technology builds community? Because some people are making that argument that communities online exist, and so it's really been a shift from a physical community to an online community. What do you think of that?
I would say it's just not the same. These aren't your neighbors necessarily, the people you talk to online.
It's a poor substitute then.
Yes.
Jess, they've actually done studies. The evidence is overwhelming that the face-to-face contact is the fullest expression of our social natures. And it's just a beautiful thing to have happen. And I think that if we hope to regain some of this social capital that we've lost, we need to encourage ourselves and others to have groups of people studying films and materials and getting in conversations again.
Roxana says she thinks that we've lost it too. She's made that comment too. And I think this is related to what's going on this year. And even in our classrooms, we've got half the country that have college students still at home on their computers. 100% online is how they're doing school. And our school has made a really strong effort to try to at least keep some of our classes open and face-to-face, in spite of all of the safety measures that we have to put in place and stuff. But it's just, and we're getting the feedback from the students and that they just really appreciate the chance to have a class where we can all come together in one room and have class.
Yes.
It seems to be making a big difference, kind of what you were saying. So
that's great.
Well, it looks
yes. Any other comments, Bill, before we go?
Well, Christian put in the chat that he feels like online communities are more accepting than in-person ones, but they aren't as trustworthy. Okay, that's pretty profound.
This is to review again this very famous analogy that was given by Plato in his account of this. And it has to do with knowledge of reality. And he starts out in this lower area here. You see these people are watching these shadows on the wall of the cave, and they see that as reality, and it's being projected by these other people who are projecting these shadows on the cave. And then, as the analogy is described by Plato, people are managing to get out of there and come up into the sunlight, and you see them coming up. And then what they're seeing in the sunlight is the real thing. So what I like to propose is that watching, it's a little bit complex, but it's that by taking the great movies that were done in this time period where America had huge doses of social capital, community feeling, solidarity, and watching those movies and discussing them, we can have one aspect, it's just one, of recovering a shared sense of what's real in the world. Mm-hmm. So that's the thought. And any comments? Yeah.
Just going to a theater and watching a film with a group of people is kind of going to build a community of sorts. And we're even getting away from that because everybody's sitting in their living room watching it, streaming it, even TV shows that the whole country used to tune in, or, you know, there were 3 networks and you had 3 choices and about a third of the people watched one, and kind of, you could always count on, you could go to work or school and talk about what you saw on television last night, and at least someone else saw the same thing you did. But now there's almost zero chance of that happening now without doing something like what we did with this.
Exactly. And that's why I just think we need to do it. And that's why I'm so grateful to you, Professor, for doing it. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So in the sunlight then, and it's maybe interesting to talk about how Raisin in the Sun is in the sunlight, and we're having beamed, we're experiencing it with them, a kind of greater, deeper understanding of some of these realities of life that have been kind of clouded over in these eras of radical individualism, the decades of the radical individualism. And one of them, it seems to me, is what is a family? What is a family? And here you see what is the nature of this family. These people obviously don't get along all that well sometimes. They have pretty rough times. But I wanted to quote for you the concept of Edmund Burke, the great 18th century British statesman, who said that a big part of living together in civil society and in civilization were these subdivisions of these little platoons of people. And he says to be attached to the subdivision, to love the little platoon we belong to in society is the first principle of public affection. And there's just this, I don't know, maybe it's just something to ponder. It's kind of mysterious, but in a kind of interesting way, the white people of America of 1959, when this play appeared, and even in Kansas there, where there was a sit-in, and there are little platoons of people, but we share a common humanity. These little platoons are not defined by whether they're Black or white people, but they're human beings gathering together. And that's where I think the magic of this film is, that we are experiencing what it means to live in a family. And that was what was happening with white audiences in Broadway, watching these Black performers knock it out of the ballpark. And the opening night of Raisin in the Sun, Broadway, 1959, these 4 people got a standing ovation. So anyway, that's a thought there. And also, this is again with the themes of Robert Putnam and others who talk about the loss of social connection, social cohesion. And so what we're seeing in this film, and we can talk about the specific ways that it happens, but you see people alienated from each other. Here's a brother and a sister here that are very deeply alienated from each other. And yet these connections are being seen by us. And in fact, we're part of it because we're kind of there with them in that Chicago slum apartment.
I'm curious.
Yes.
So for our group that's here, this question that I thought of when I saw your social beings versus autonomous selves. Are we making any headway? I mean, because I think we've kind of agreed that we've migrated towards being more self-focused and stuff, but do going through experiences like we have this year, or great tragedies in the country like 9/11. I mean, 9/11 showed that was an instant change in the country, and we automatically went back to family and community and all of that. And I'm wondering if that's happening at all this year, or maybe on a smaller level. I mean, it doesn't really feel like it's doing that, because we've all been pushed in to go home, stay home. That's the kind thing to do, is to stay away from people almost. It just seems weird to me that it's so different than 9/11, even though we're going through another tragedy as far as this pandemic and stuff. Anybody else want to comment on that, or do you see have any sense of more community? Or
I feel less community, but I long for the connection, and I miss it terribly.
Who are the takers and who are the givers in the younger family?
This is a great question to raise. I would say that the grandmother is definitely a giver. And I would say Ruth is a giver as well.
Yes.
And Bethina, I don't know how to say her name. The sister is Benitha is more of a taker. And
how does Walter Lee gain moral perspective and hope for the future? I'm interested in any comments to be thinking, how does he really get this? Because he goes from a person of very, very kind of narrow vision and exchanges. He doesn't seem to get it, but then he really does get this moral perspective.
Walter had to progress beyond that point of view. in a short time in the
in a very short time. Well, these words challenge and controversy are almost mild compared to what Walter Lee is facing in his situation. Is really pretty dark, pretty dire. And yet the greatness of this film is how bad off he is, but how far he comes. Is it believable? I think it's believable. I think that's the greatness of his performance, is that he makes it believable, because it is a very short period of time, isn't it? Really.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's go on here. So this is, of course, I think Walter Lee is actually, and I'd love for you guys to weigh in on this, isn't he really overhearing this conversation? But here's what Mama Younger says. She says, take into account the hills and the valleys he's come through to get where he is. Of course, she's helping Beneatha to see. We did this with a group of high school students just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And so it was fun, and it was fresh in my mind as I put this in. And he said, well, isn't it strange? He puts it to Beneatha. He said that a family is so taken up with the loss of something they really didn't even have until a few weeks ago. I love this. I love Assegai because I actually met people like Assegai when I was at Howard. Because in 1960, a lot of the African countries had just become newly independent. Mm. And their young men, just like Assegai, were coming to the United States to study. And there were many of these young people from these countries, including Nigeria, and they would wear their dress. Just remember when he gave Beneatha the dress, and so they would wear their clothes, and I'd see them in the cafeteria, and we'd be getting pancakes or something, and I'd say, well, where are you from? And they were a very great presence on the campus of Howard in that spring semester of 1960. And it was their first time coming there, because these countries had all gotten their independence right in that very time. So Lorraine Hansberry is writing about somebody that would have really been like that, from these newly independent countries from Africa, studying in the United States. Movies like Raisin in the Sun are really great cultural goods, and they were great goods of that type when they were coming out, and they are today. This is the famous Fred Astaire, danced in the 30s with Ginger Rogers, probably the most legendary song and dance man that we have in our cultural heritage. And just a few months before Pearl Harbor, you see a Life magazine cover with Fred Astaire dancing with his own little son. And so it's kind of this idea that I just wanted to share with all of you that was part of those years. And of course, as I said, I grew up in the post-war years. I was coming of age. I was a little girl at that time. But this whole idea of family, community, connection, the kind of connections that we've been talking about, it just struck me as interesting that the Life magazine cover would be not Fred and Ginger dancing or something like that, but Fred just in a simple home situation dancing with his own little son. So I just wanted to share that with you. On the solidarity, there's a great Abraham Lincoln quote that I don't have in the slideshow, but you may want to look into that famous quote that was Abraham Lincoln that talked about the better angels of our human nature or something like that. And it's a very wonderful, famous quote. But I took that for the whole idea of rebuilding solidarity is looking to the better side of our human nature instead of the negative divisions that we have to do that, and how great this film is to help us to do that. Okay, on the universality, I think this is one thing I do want to share with you, is that one of the things that comes out in, this is in Robert Putnam's book too, is that these trends toward greater community were actually going on. Like he talks about the issues of racial discrimination and gender inequality, for example. And he actually has a lot of documentation that race relations were getting better. Slowly and gradually they were. But he speaks to that in the sense that some people think that things were really terrible, and then all of a sudden we did have the civil rights eruption movement in the late, 1959s, let's say. And he makes the point that there really was, it was better than we thought. It still wasn't good at all, but it was better than sometimes it's spoken of. So we can go ahead. And that's all. I just have the reference to the study guide itself, which is available on Amazon.
Well, thank you, Dr. McGraw, for sharing your time and expertise with us on these films.
Thank you. This has been fun.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is
See you next time.